Okay, so in the last one we talked a bit about the comparative anatomies of different organisms, and we went into uh, what adaptations are and how they are able to confer survival advantages to organisms possessing those adaptations. We should note that there are constraints on natural selection with regards to these adaptations. So if we were to imagine, for example, the peppered moth example again, if we're talking about camouflage, okay, we'd say that the colour of the moth is an adaptation to facilitate this camouflage, which is a survival advantage, because if you're camouflaged, you're less likely to get eaten. But there are a few anatomical constraints to how adaptations can actually come about. So you can imagine like a moth like this. If the moth looked exactly like a leaf, or if it didn't look like a moth at all, uh, it would be a lot harder to see, and it would be virtually undetectable, so nothing would eat it. But the thing is, it can't just magically kind of go from being a moth here to being some kind of like, I don't know, for simplicity's sake, let's say it wants to become a little pebble. It doesn't have the anatomical constraints to do that, so it's limited. The adaptations that an organism can develop to increase their likelihood of survival are limited to the actual anatomical structures of the animal. So an example I like to talk about is dragons in fiction. So an organism is an aggregate of many traits which can adapt independently of one another if naturally selected. These traits themselves place constraints on the possibilities for natural selection, as only existing traits can be adapted. So the example that I'm talking about, if dragons evolved from reptiles, so, just think of a lizard, quadrupedal, 4 legs, 4 limbs, then a dragon that adapts from one of these kind of quadrupedal reptiles, well, it's going to have its 4 limbs, and it's going to have its hind limbs. Now, if we look at the two different types of dragons shown on the right, the top dragon has 4 legs and 2 wings coming from the back, so that would imply that the organism would have had 6 limbs, whereas the dragon on the bottom has adapted its front limbs into wings and adapted its hind limbs into this kind of smaller perching kind of structures that you see in birds, bats, pterosaurs. The bottom one is far more realistic than the top one because of these anatomical constraints on how a trait can be adapted through natural selection. So in order for this top one to be true, you would have to go from this kind of quadrupedal lizard. It would first have to sprout 2 new limbs magically, and then it would have to somehow adapt those 2 new limbs on its back into wings. Whereas the bottom example, it would just have to take its already existing 4 limbs and adapt those into wings. So this is far more realistic. We see it in pterosaurs, we see it in birds, we see it in bats. And we call this a more parsimonious explanation, so it requires fewer leaps to happen. So because an organism is anatomically constrained to what it can do, it's far more feasible for an organism to just adapt its 4 limbs, which it already has, into wings, rather than sprouting out 2 new limbs out of nowhere, and then adapting those new limbs into wings. So basically what I'm trying to get at is, if you go from a regular lizard, it only has 4 limbs. So if it's going to become a dragon, that dragon is going to only have 4 limbs, unless it somehow has some kind of homobox development where it's deformed and it has extra limbs. But we're going to, for simplicity's sake, we'll just ignore that because it's a lot less likely anyway. But yeah, organisms have physical anatomical constraints that put limitations on how they're actually able to evolve. So a lizard is more likely to turn into this structure with 4 limbs than this creature with 6 limbs. Hopefully that makes sense. So the constraints on the power of natural selection tend to be minor, providing the population is large. So natural selection tends to be the null hypothesis for a lot of traits that we see, but although this is kind of disputed, when we talk about specifically, we say that drift becomes the null hypothesis. It's a bit confusing, so I won't really go into it much. It doesn't really matter. So alternatives to natural selection are genetic drift. So a trait may evolve as a product of genetic drift if it is indirectly selected when linked to a selected trait. So say you have one of these finches, let's say that beak, the type of beak is kind of linked to its color. So let's say that the thick beak is linked to a darker color and the kind of thinner beak is linked to a lighter color. They'd be inherited together if we're in a period where these thick-beaked seed-eating finches are increasing in frequency in the population. We're also going to see an increase in the frequency of the allele linked to that thick beak, which is giving these birds their darker color. Or a trait may serve a secondary trait, so a trait may evolve as a secondary trait for which it was not initially intended. For example, the kea in New Zealand evolved its beak for eating whatever small, I don't know what kea eats, mammals, birds, nuts. They're certainly not supposed to eat sheep. But when the New Zealand colonists brought sheep to New Zealand, the kea already had this beak structure, and it decided it was able to use it to prey on the defenseless sheep population in New Zealand. So it already had this beak, and now the beak is serving a secondary trait of allowing the keas to eat the sheep, and the sheep don't have anything they can do to defend themselves against it. So, moving on to selection and fitness of these traits. Selection refers to any consistent difference in fitness among different classes of biological entities, while fitness refers to the number of offspring an individual leaves in the next generation. For example, if 1 in 1,000 seeds live to reproduce, and each plant will produce 3,000 seeds, then that's going to result in a fitness of 3. Where if an individual emerges allows them to produce 5,000 seeds, that trait is going to be naturally selected because it increases fitness, because we'll have the same survival probability, but because it's producing more seeds, it would be 0.001 multiplied by 5,000, and it would have a fitness of 5. So we would be able to know that organisms with this trait have a high fitness, and it's going to be naturally selected and increase in frequency within the population.